For more than a decade, millions of Americans tuned in every week to watch him compete, curse at rivals, and haul some of the most valuable fish in the world out of the North Atlantic. But the man they thought they knew, the one they argued about in comment sections and followed through season after season, was only half the story. Dave Marciano's real life, the one the cameras never fully reached, was harder, stranger, and far more interesting than anything that ever made it to air. Gloucester, Massachusetts sits at the northeastern edge of Cape Ann, about 35 miles north of Boston, and it has been a commercial fishing port for longer than the United States has existed as a country. The city's famous Fisherman Memorial, a bronze statue of a man gripping a ship's wheel, facing the sea, has stood there since 1925. The inscription reads, "They that go down to the sea in ships." In Gloucester, that line isn't poetry. It's a job description that has been passed from generation to generation for nearly 4 centuries. Dave Marciano grew up in this world, not around it, inside it. The kind of place where the smell of salt water and diesel fuel is so constant, it stops registering as a smell and becomes just the air. Where the men in your family fish, where the men in your neighborhood fish, where the measure of a person is not what they studied or where they went to school, but whether they can handle themselves on the water, when conditions turn and everything goes wrong at once. He came into commercial fishing in the 1980s. This matters more than it might seem, because the 1980s were a specific and consequential era for the New England fishing industry. The groundfish stocks, cod, haddock, yellowtail flounder, were being fished at rates that were already beginning to alarm scientists, though the political will to act on those alarms was minimal. Gloucester was still a working port of real scale, but the cracks in the foundation were there. The men who built careers in that era did so without any guarantee that the industry they were entering would survive long enough to support them through a working life. Marciano built his career anyway. By the time any camera ever pointed at him, he had already spent decades learning how to find fish, how to rig a boat for specific conditions, how to manage a crew, how to read weather, and how to absorb the financial losses that are as much a part of commercial fishing as the catches. None of that backstory was visible on television. What viewers saw was a man who seemed to arrive fully formed, confident, competitive, occasionally combative, and extraordinarily good at his job. The reality was that he had spent 30-plus years becoming that man before the show ever existed. There is no shortcut to that kind of knowledge, and television has no grammar for depicting it. And if you think the show captured any of that, stay with me, because this next part is why the whole story matters. National Geographic premiered Wicked Tuna in April 2012, and within its first season it became one of the network's highest-rated shows. The concept was straightforward. Follow a group of commercial bluefin tuna fishermen out of Gloucester as they competed across a season to land the most fish by weight and value. The boats had names, the captains had personalities. The fish were worth extraordinary amounts of money. It worked. Dave Marciano and the hard merchandise were part of the show from the beginning. And what the audience responded to in Marciano was something specific and hard to manufacture. He was clearly the real thing. Not a personality cast because he tested well in a focus group, but an actual working fisherman who happened to be compelling on camera. His edges were real, his knowledge was real, his frustration when the fish weren't there was real, his satisfaction when they were, that was real too. But here is something the show's framing worked against, not intentionally, but structurally. Wicked Tuna is a competition show. Competition shows, by design, need winners and losers, confrontations and resolutions, rising and falling fortunes across a season arc. The editorial machinery of reality television is built to produce narrative, and narrative requires compression, selection, and framing. What that means in practice is this. The version of bluefin fishing that Wicked Tuna presented was dramatically more exciting, more resolution-oriented, and more legible than the actual job it was ostensibly documenting. The actual job involves long stretches of nothing. Days at sea where the fish simply aren't there, or they're there but not biting, or they're biting but the conditions make landing one impossible. It involves mechanical failures at the worst moments. It involves decisions about whether to run fuel costs chasing a school that might not be worth the burn. It involves watching the weather closely not because it makes good television, but because going out in the wrong conditions can kill you. None of that is invisible on the show. Some of it is there, but it is always in service of narrative momentum. Every difficult moment exists to set up a resolution. Every failure is a setup for a comeback. That is the grammar of reality television, and it is largely incompatible with the actual grammar of a working life, which is not organized around story arcs, Marciano understood this distinction better than most viewers ever did. And that understanding, the gap between the show's version of his life and the actual texture of it, is the beginning of the double life this story is about. But here's the part that changes everything about what you just heard. Atlantic bluefin tuna, Thunus thinus, is one of the most remarkable fish in the ocean. It is also one of the most regulated, most politically contested, and most economically complex commodities in the global seafood market. Wicked Tuna treated it as a prize to be caught and a dollar sign to be converted. That framing was not wrong, exactly, but it left out almost everything that actually determined whether a season on the water was financially viable. Start with the quota. The Atlantic bluefin fishery is managed internationally by the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas, known as ICCAT. Every year, ICCAT sets a total allowable catch for the entire North Atlantic, and that catch is divided between the United States and a range of other nations. The U.S. portion is then divided among commercial fishermen through a permit system administered by NOAA's Highly Migratory Species Division. What this means in practical terms is that every boat fishing bluefin, including the hard merchandise, is operating against a hard annual ceiling on how many pounds it can legally land. You do not just go out and catch as many fish as you can find. You catch up to what your permit and your quota allocation allow, and then you stop. This has enormous implications for the competitive dynamic that Wicked Tuna presented. Winning the show's competition, landing the most fish by weight and value across the season, is genuinely meaningful. But the quota system means that what looks like an open race is actually happening inside a regulatory box that the show almost never discussed in detail. Then there is the price. Atlantic bluefin tuna caught by U.S. fishermen is sold almost entirely into the Japanese sashimi market. The Tokyo auction system, now based at the Toyosu market after the old Tsukiji market relocated, is effectively the price-setting mechanism for premium bluefin worldwide. The price per pound a U.S. fisherman receives depends on the fish's grade, whether it meets the fat content, color, and texture standards for top-tier sashimi, and on current Japanese market demand, which fluctuates based on economic conditions in Japan, competition from Atlantic and Pacific bluefin from other sources, and the time of year. A single large bluefin tuna, a fish weighing 600, 700, 800 pounds, can be worth anywhere from several $1,000s to upward of $40,000 depending on its grade and the market that week. The difference between a grade A fish and a grade B fish off the same boat on the same day can be the difference between a profitable trip and a break-even one. And that grade is determined not just by how well the fisherman caught the fish, but by what happens in the minutes immediately after it comes aboard. This is where Marciano's real expertise becomes visible in a way the show could only gesture at. How quickly the fish is bled, a cut made immediately to drain blood from the gills and prevent the meat from degrading, and how thoroughly it is iced in the hours following the catch directly determines its grade. A fish that spends too long before proper handling loses the quality that commands premium prices. This is not a dramatic moment that telegraphs well on television. It is a technical process, practiced and refined over years, that is the difference between the price you get and the price you wish you'd gotten. The number that came next, nobody who followed this channel expected it. Run the numbers on a commercial bluefin fishing operation, and the television fantasy starts to look very different. A boat the size of the hard merchandise burns somewhere in the range of 30 to 50 gallons of diesel per hour at cruising speed. A run to productive grounds off Gloucester, say out to the Stellwagen Bank or further southeast toward the canyon edges, can mean 4 to 8 hours of travel each way, sometimes more. On a day when the fish don't cooperate, a crew can spend more money on fuel than the trip earns. This is not an edge case. This is part of the regular calculus of the job. Then there are the fixed costs that run regardless of whether you're catching fish. Commercial fishing permits and licenses, especially the highly migratory species permits required to fish bluefin, carry significant annual costs. Boat insurance, dock fees, equipment maintenance, and crew wages all accrue whether the fish are running or not. The boat itself represents a capital investment that requires ongoing upkeep. A commercial fishing vessel that isn't maintained reliably is a liability, not an asset. What this means is that the competition arc of Wicked Tuna, will Dave beat Tyler this week, who's ahead on the leaderboard, which boat will top the final tally, was always happening against a financial backdrop that was never the show's primary subject. A captain could win the on-screen competition and still end the season with a narrower profit margin than the drama suggested. The TV tally counted fish. The actual business counted what was left after fuel, crew, maintenance, permits, and the inevitable mechanical repairs that no commercial fishing season avoids. Dave Marciano understood this math because he had been living it for decades before anyone pointed a camera at him. The show gave him a national audience. It did not change the fundamental economics of the job he was actually doing. And for years, those two realities coexisted in the same vessel, one feeding a story that millions of people watched, the other running underneath it as the actual substance of his working life. At this point in the story, most people walked away. What he did instead is the part nobody talks about. Wicked Tuna filmed during bluefin season, broadly from spring through early fall, when the fish are present in New England waters in catchable numbers. The show's episodes tracked the arc of that season, building toward an end-of-season tally that determined who won. Then the cameras left. What happened after the cameras left is the part of Dave Marciano's life that the show's audience never saw. And it is also the part that most directly illuminates the distance between the TV version of his story and the real one. Commercial fishing in New England is not a seasonal job for the people who depend on it as their primary income. The bluefin season is one part of a larger operational calendar. When bluefin season ends, other work begins, or doesn't, depending on the year, the market, the regulatory conditions, and what work is available. The boats don't go into dry dock and wait for spring. They continue to be maintained, licensed, insured, and as actively used as market conditions allow. For a captain like Marciano, the off-camera months were not downtime. They were the continuation of the actual job, stripped of the television layer. No producer structuring the day. No dramatic arc being assembled in post-production. Just a working boat, a working crew, and the ongoing project of making a commercial fishing operation financially viable, in an era when the New England fishing industry was under substantial pressure. The groundfish collapse that had been building since the 1980s reached full crisis in the 1990s and 2000s, fundamentally reshaping what was economically possible for Gloucester fishermen. Bluefin tuna became one of the bright spots, a high-value species with a global premium market, accessible to fishermen who had the permits, the equipment, and the skills to pursue it. But that didn't make it easy. It made it viable. There is a significant distance between those two things. Marciano's identity outside the cameras was also, in one important sense, the inverse of what television rewarded. Reality television rewards visible personality, conflict, color, quotable moments, the kind of dramatic energy that cuts well. The actual job rewards patience, precision, accumulated knowledge, and the willingness to make unglamorous decisions over and over again in conditions that don't care about your television schedule. One phone call, one conversation, that's all it took to change the direction of everything. Dave Marciano's presence on Wicked Tuna changed over the course of the show's run. The early seasons featured him prominently. The hard merchandise was one of the show's signature boats, and Marciano's competitive relationship with captains like Tyler McLaughlin of the Pinwheel gave the series much of its interpersonal tension. That rivalry, between two different styles of fishing and two very different personalities, was genuinely compelling television because it was grounded in something real. Over time, as the show continued into its later seasons, the cast evolved. Wicked Tuna brought in new boats, new captains, new locations, including a spin-off series set in North Carolina's Outer Banks, and the original Gloucester roster changed. Marciano's regular presence diminished. He was no longer the central competitive figure the show had built its early seasons around. What is notable about this departure is what it did and didn't mean. For a television personality, someone whose identity and livelihood are primarily constructed around their on-screen presence, a reduction in camera time would represent a significant loss. The platform would shrink, the brand would diminish. There would be pressure to maintain visibility, to stay in the story, to negotiate back into the frame. Marciano's situation was different because his identity was never primarily constructed around the television show. He was a commercial fisherman who had appeared on a television show, not a television personality who happened to fish. The cameras had attached to a life that already existed in full before they arrived. And when those cameras became less central to his work, the life beneath them continued. This is the quiet reality that the title of this video points toward. The double life was not a secret kept from others. It was the gap between a public identity shaped by television and a private one shaped by decades of actual work, and the way those two identities coexisted, sometimes comfortably, sometimes not, across more than a decade of being one of reality television's most recognizable fishermen. Here's what the comments kept asking, and here's the answer they never got, until now. It would be easy and wrong to frame this as a story about television deceiving its audience. Wicked Tuna did not fabricate what it showed. The fish were real, the catches were real. The competitive stakes were real. The relationship between these fishermen, the respect and rivalry that existed alongside each other, was real. Marciano's skill was real. His wins were earned. What the cameras missed was not falsehood, it was context. They missed the Gloucester that surrounds the dock, the city that has spent decades navigating the loss of an industry that once defined it. The fishing families who adapted or didn't, the boats that kept fishing, and the ones that didn't make it. The fishing memorial on the waterfront has 5,368 names on it, men from Gloucester who died at sea. That number keeps growing. The memorial is not a historical artifact. It is a living document. They missed the specific weight of fishing as a vocation in a culture where it is also an inheritance. The question of whether to keep doing this, whether to expose yourself and your crew to the ocean's indifference year after year, for margins that fluctuate with a commodity market in Tokyo, is one that people like Marciano answer through action rather than words. You either go out or you don't. Most viewers never had to confront what that question actually cost. They miss the way expertise looks when it's fully embedded in a person rather than performed for an audience. Marciano's knowledge of bluefin behavior, of Atlantic weather systems, of gear rigging, of fish handling, none of it was visible as a discrete skill on television because it wasn't presented as a skill. It was just him doing his job. The show's audience saw the results without access to the depth of accumulated knowledge that produced them, and they missed the particular loneliness that comes with any work that requires you to be away, from family, from land, from the rhythms of regular life, for extended stretches. The camera can follow a boat out to sea and record the horizon and capture the faces of the crew. It cannot show what it actually costs to be the person responsible for that boat, that crew, and the catch that pays for all of it. The weight of that responsibility doesn't compress well into broadcast segments. What the camera captured was the surface of a life that had genuine depth. The surface was compelling enough to draw millions of viewers for over a decade. The depth was the part that the man himself had been living all along, without audience, without production support, without an editorial team deciding which parts were worth keeping. And if you think that was surprising, stay with me, because this next part is why the whole story matters. The Wicked Tuna that exists today is a different show than the one that premiered in 2012. The cast has rotated, the format has expanded. The original Gloucester cohort, the group that gave the show its initial character, has changed significantly. Some of those captains are still on the water. Some have moved on to other things. The show continues because the format works, and the audience is still there. Dave Marciano has remained part of the world the show came from, even as his regular presence in front of the cameras has changed. The hard merchandise is a working vessel, not a display piece, and Gloucester is still his home. The bluefin fishery, heavily regulated, internationally managed, perpetually subject to quota adjustments and market fluctuations, is still operating, and the men who built careers in it are still out there, doing the work that precedes and outlasts any television show that happens to document it. What has changed is the audience's relationship to him. The viewers who followed the early seasons of Wicked Tuna have, in many cases, developed a sense of knowing these fishermen that outpaced what the show could actually deliver. They know the TV Dave Marciano, competitive, direct, deeply skilled, occasionally profane, always watchable. They have opinions about whether he was treated fairly by the show, whether his catches were accurately depicted, whether he deserved more credit in seasons where the editing marginalized him. What they are less certain about is the fuller version. The man who existed before the show, during the show's off-season, and in the parts of his life that cameras were never pointed at. The man who spent decades mastering a craft that the show used as a setting rather than a subject. The man whose relationship with the North Atlantic is not a dramatic arc, but a fact of daily life that neither begins nor ends on anyone else's production schedule. That version of Dave Marciano has always been there. It was the one doing the actual fishing when the cameras arrived, and it is the one that remained when they moved on.
The mine, he moves right to Monday.
It is the one that ran underneath it, a man who spent his life building deep expertise in one of the most demanding, economically precarious, and physically dangerous occupations available in the modern United States, and who then let a television show use that life as its backdrop for over a decade, without the life itself ever being fully visible. What comes next for Marciano is, in many ways, the same as what came before the cameras arrived. The North Atlantic, the hard merchandise, the permanent negotiation between what the ocean offers and what a working fishing operation needs. The bluefin fishery will continue to be shaped by ICCAT quota decisions, by Japanese market demand, by fuel prices and regulatory frameworks, and the unpredictable behavior of a species that does not care about anyone's season arc. He will continue to navigate all of that, as he always has, largely outside the frame. There is something worth sitting with here. Do you think the version of Dave Marciano that Wicked Tuna gave you was ever the real one? Or did the show always give you just enough to make you feel like you knew him, while the actual person stayed one layer deeper than the cameras could reach?